Hello and welcome to the Wisden Women's Cricket Weekly podcast in association with Metro Bank. Metro Bank is the first ever champion partner of women's and girls cricket, and this year, together with the ECB, they are launching the Metro Bank Girls in Cricket Fund with the ambition of tripling the number of girls cricket teams by the end of 2026. Metro Bank wants to provide more chances for women and girls to thrive in their community and to create more positive role models. So through the Girls in Cricket Fund, they'll be focusing on recruiting, educating, supporting and celebrating the people that make girls' cricket happen in clubs up and down the country. To get involved, head to metrobankonline.co.uk/cricket, where you can discover more about the Metro Bank Girls in Cricket Fund and help to champion the future of girls' cricket. A few weeks ago, the ECB announced their third major domestic restructure in 8 years, allocating 8 counties Tier 1 status. Controversially, Yorkshire were one of the 10 counties not immediately awarded Tier 1 status, leaving Northern Diamonds players, who are generally based at Headingley, in limbo. Lauren is Yorkshire through and plays for the Diamonds. She shares her thoughts on the news, how it's impacted the Diamonds dressing room, and what the latest restructure needs to get right from the players' point of view. Lauren, what do you think about the overall restructure? Is it a good thing? What do you think it'll do for the game?
I think the overarching feeling is that it's going to drive the game forward, isn't it? And getting the teams aligned with counties, which, you know, the bigger picture thinking is that that's a good thing. It just makes it a little bit cleaner for men's and women's, and where, you know, like being at a region like Northern Diamonds, where it's a little bit grey and a little bit clunky as to sort of who has that allegiance, who hosts. You know, like Yorkshire aren't all in for the Diamonds and Durham aren't all in, because we're not really sure who's got what piece of the pie. So I think the overarching rationale for trying to align it is a good thing. And if you're striving for like that equality piece, and which seems to be a big driver, and it makes it obvious, doesn't it? You've got cricket is the umbrella, and then underneath you've got men's and women's, and it should look pretty similar underneath that. So I think it's a good thing for sure, and I think that, like I say, the reason for wanting to go down that avenue is a good one.
Yeah, even from a fan point of view, cricket can be quite a difficult sport to follow at the best of times. So sort of having fewer brands, I guess, is a good thing. Yorkshire were one of the 10 counties overlooked for initial Tier 1 status. In case people haven't detected, Lauren's accent, a Yorkshire accent. She's from Yorkshire. She plays for the Diamonds. We'll get into your reaction to the news in a bit. But could you talk us through how the current system works? Where are the Diamonds based? Where do the players who play for the Diamonds live?
Yeah, so the Northern Diamonds is obviously, it's actually under Northumberland, Durham and Yorkshire. That's how it sort of works. The three parts of the region come together, and the Northern Diamonds. In terms of our host, really has been 80% Yorkshire. In terms of where we train, where we've played majority of our games. Obviously, we have had fixtures up in Durham, and around those fixtures, you know, Durham host us in terms of the training and the prep around those games. But the sort of day-to-day and, you know, where you reside generally is we've been based out of Headingley. You know, what that looks like, all the players, you know, commute to Headingley, live around sort of the Yorkshire region. Holly's captain, she's in Huddersfield. You know, a lot of the girls are sort of Leeds based or Sheffield based, and have been majority. Like I said, we have trained up in Durham. We've had camps up in Durham. We've had fixtures up there. But in terms of like the sort of day to day, and, you know, the percentage of where we do most of our work, it's been predominantly out of Headingley, really.
So what does this mean for the players? What's the chat been like since the news came through? Because you've got a pretty young squad, a little young players having to grapple with quite difficult questions about potentially having to relocate. I mean, Durham, Northumberland, that's a vast area that the Diamonds currently covers, and Durham getting that Tier 1 status, that's not an easy move for a young player to make.
Yeah, I think the general feeling was just unsettled, and I think it was a shock, to be honest. You know, we're obviously we're not stupid. We've been aware of sort of the turbulence at Yorkshire over the last few years. But I think in terms of the strength of women's cricket, we were quite shocked, really. And then it's just unsettling, isn't it? I think, the nature in which we found out, obviously via a leak, was I actually, funnily enough, I found out through Catherine Brunt, because she texted me and she was like, "Oh mate, really gutted, like thinking of all the girls and what," and I was at some yoga retreat with Phoebe Graham from Lancs, and I was thinking, what's Brunty on about? Because it was obviously early as well.
Yeah.
When we found out, and I was like, what's she on about? And then obviously our player group for Northern Diamonds was going off. So my news source was actually Catherine Brunt. But yeah, it was just people were shocked and surprised, and it's just a big life change, isn't it? I think, young players, I guess you look at some of the youngsters like a Catherine Fraser, for example. She's moved to Leeds Uni to, obviously she moved for cricket, and to obviously get her education bit as well. But she moved there because she wanted to sort of pursue her cricket. And then the landscape changes, doesn't it? And the other thing I think is more challenging for a lot of the youngsters is they haven't got a lot of skin in the game yet. So, your value of a team that you've been at for 2 or 3 years is quite high versus what the rest of the country might value you as. We see the day-to-day stuff that goes behind the scenes, how people train, and that might not be coming to fruition yet in performances. But then, you've got your team is basically gone at that level to play in tier one. And if you haven't got a lot of sort of skin in the game and a lot of performances under your belt, particularly, it's like, okay, well, will Durham want me? I haven't punched out, 500-600 run seasons yet. But what Diamonds value us at is highly, so that's probably a little bit of the young players, I guess, vulnerability that they sort of feel at the minute. And then you've got you've got people on the other end of the spectrum where it's sort of like me and Katie Levick, where we've been at Yorkshire for 15 years, and you sort of always felt like you would probably start and finish there. And like for me, I've got a wife who lives here, who has a job here, my family live close by. Everybody has different parts that come into it. Like for me, I'm not necessarily concerned cricket wise, because I feel like I've probably done enough, particularly at that level where you feel like you'd be valued in most teams. But then it's the whole life piece, isn't it? Is how that looks life wise, whether it's the girls at uni or the girls who have got friends and family nearby, or partners, or whatever. So I think everyone's unsettled in different ways.
Yeah, I guess what is maybe unique in the Yorkshire case is that the news disrupts an existing professional setup. There's an existing base around Yorkshire, even though this isn't a Yorkshire team. That is where a lot of the players live. So, if you compare it to other counties that felt aggrieved, they perhaps don't have that existing base. And you mentioned it was an unsettling piece of news to take in. Just go back to the timing of it. You got the leak from Catherine, but the official news was only 2 days before the start of the season as well. That must have been really tough.
Yeah, I know it was really tough. Like we had a lot of meetings, both player meetings and sort of like with Yorkshire, and explaining, what obviously the news and from their point of view, and then the PCA offering their sort of piece, like support wise. And I think, it's very individual. It was like, for someone like me, I almost felt like I was like, I don't want to play the first game. Like, this is not the news we wanted to hear, sort of thing. But I actually think, like, credit where credit's due in terms of the Diamonds girls. I actually think it really galvanized us that first game. And it was almost like, well, we'll show them how good a cricket team we are. And if players and cricket are at the forefront of what the game's, supposed to be about, then we'll show that we're one of the best cricket teams in the country. And I think it almost brought us together in that bit. But it was, training was weird. There was a weird vibe around. Like, I remember the day we came in after we found out, and we sort of had like a drop-in optional session. And it was just almost like there was like some of the girls that were just doing like range hitting, even though we were getting ready for 50 over cricket, that were just like, I think Emma Marlowe was just like teeing off. And I was like, oh, you're getting a bit of anger out there, Marlowe. She's just literally trying to smoke everything. And there was just there's just an uneasy sort of like presence around training, and I think that was probably natural. Like it's a weird feeling thinking that essentially the team that you're part of now is not going to exist in a year's time at the level that you want it to exist at.
And the weird thing with the York situation is that Yorkshire has been assured of tier 1 status, but in 2 years' time. So does that almost make the decision what certain players do harder? Because it's not as if Yorkshire is forever tier 2. Using Catherine Fraser as an example, she could, in theory, and other players in her situation could choose to forego a professional contract for the next couple of years and almost wait for Yorkshire to be a tier 1 county. Has that actually made it more complicated in a weird way?
Oh, 100%. I think not just from a playing point of view, but I think like if I was a director of cricket somewhere, it'd make it quite difficult for them as well. Like you have this opportunity whereby cricket is going to be aligned to counties, and it's sort of a free-for-all, isn't it? There's no rules to say that, I don't know, Central Sparks are going to just sign all, like Warwickshire are just going to sign all the Central Sparks. Why? Like, it's a bit of an open market for everybody. And if you're a director of cricket trying to build your team and build a legacy, you've then got to, you play a length of contracts, how, you're going to want to lock people in for a long term. And then how does that leave Yorkshire and Glamorgan if people are on sort of 3-4 year deals? Have you got the availability of enough good players to then make up the other two teams? If you're trying to build something, you're sort of looking beyond 1 or 2 years, don't you? So you want investment for that. If you're signing a Northern Diamonds player, you want investment long term. So it sort of doesn't really help players or the teams either. In my opinion, it makes it quite challenging for both. And the 2 years thing is like, for a lot of our girls, you'd have to relocate. It's still a decent, you can't be commuting to Durham every day. You're still an hour and a half, an hour and 40-minute drive for most people. Someone like Holly, it's probably nearly 2.5 hours. So you're looking at a relocation, and then it's like, okay, well, how long do you relocate for? Do you pack up shop and relocate for 3 or 4 years, or do you want to come back? Or you don't know what those teams are going to look, you don't know what the makeup of those teams are going to look like in 2 years. And everybody as a player, like, you want to be part of champion, you want to win trophies, you want to be in finals. And that's the hard piece around like the Yorkshire and Glamorgan, is like, what are they going to look like when they're back in this tier 1? Are they going to be strong? Are they going to be able to compete? Is there enough good players left in the country that aren't signed long-term deals to make up these two teams and make it competitive? Because, from the league point of view, the last thing you want is two teams that are, reasonably hampered because they're late to the party. Then all the rest that are sort of, they've managed to build something and they're quite settled and they've got a squad and they've got a core and all that sort of stuff, where obviously the two extras are not going to have any of that.
It's obviously been a few turbulent years for Yorkshire off the field. Talk us through what it's been like from your perspective in the women's structure. Has it been as turbulent on the women's side of things as it has been on the men's side?
Oh, I think, like we're obviously, the whole club there's been a lot of change. That's just fact. There's been a large turnover of staff, and what's happened is it's been rocky and it's been unstable. But I think one thing is, and probably credit really to the staff and the players at Diamond, like I can only speak for Diamonds, but I would say it's probably quite similar for the Yorkshire lads on the shop floor, and in terms of the cricket and the day-to-day of your training and your preparation and your opportunities to play, and sort of how the things that actually impact you as a player, it hasn't really felt like it's affected us all that much, to be honest. And I think that's probably a credit, like I say, to the cricket staff and the people that sort of, like the leadership and the hierarchy and all that sort of stuff. As obviously there's been a lot of change, a lot of different bums on seats in terms of that. But the cricket side of things, and I think that's a reflection, you can see that from, sort of how people are performing, how the team's running, are they competing, etc. And they've been, we've been doing that. So I think that piece hasn't felt like it's affected us. It's probably not right to say at all, because the change is always difficult with who to report to for what, and I know that a lot of the cricket staff have been under the pump because above that there hasn't been directors of cricket and those sorts of things. So our staff have definitely worked overtime, but credit to them because it's sort of not been felt from a playing point of view.
As of 3:30 in the afternoon on Wednesday, Yorkshire haven't actually given up hope yet of being a Tier 1 county in 2025. Do you want to talk us through what the proposal currently is?
Yeah, so the sort of, I think like where the sort of at the minute is, I guess is like self-funding, proposing a self-funding scenario in terms of, obviously Colin Graves and Phil Hodgson have come in, and I guess the thing is you're bidding for financial backing, aren't you, from the ECB? That's what the bids are. I think it's, I don't know if it's 1.2 million or 1.8 million into women's cricket per year or something like that. Don't quote the figures, but it's roughly, and that's what you're essentially bidding for, aren't you, when you proposed to host a Tier 1 team. Now I guess they've sort of gone back and said, well, if we're proposing to get financial backing, can we do it without that, essentially, in terms of if we're willing to pay the 1.8 million or whatever it is into women's cricket per year to have a women's cricket team, can we play in Tier 1? And yeah, that's sort of where they're at. I think that, I guess the thing is that there was always the financial uncertainty over Yorkshire, wasn't there, in terms of the last few years and where the lay of the land is, and they've probably never been in a position where you could sort of propose something like that, because finances, have been a worry. There's still probably things, no doubt, that the ECB, money's not everything. You're going to have your I's dotted and your T's crossed. I don't know what that looks like from an ECB point of view. I don't know what the time frame is on that. It's, as a player, it's a weird one, isn't it? Because it's almost like it's not a closed book, but nobody really knows when a decision's going to be made, when the door will maybe stay ajar, or when the door will be shut. Like nobody really knows. I think it's one of those things where it's almost like it might be the hope that kills you a little bit, in terms of there's not going to be a women's team next year, and you're looking at other opportunities, and then it's like, oh, but we're not sure yet, just sit tight. So it feels like it's been very much back and forth, and the hard bit, like I definitely think the hard bit is just trying to withdraw yourself emotionally from it a little bit, because otherwise you sort of hang on everybody's word and you just don't know the sort of timelines and the outcomes of what might happen, and to do with any of it, really.
Yeah, definitely sounds like there's more uncertainty, not less at the moment. Finally, I wanted to ask you about there's so much chat about what the news means for the counties. As a player, what is important to you, and what do you think needs to be gotten right with the restructure? What things from a player experience point of view need to be nailed straight away from 2025?
I think the biggest thing that needs to be nailed, and I don't think there's an obvious answer of how you do that just in terms of the volume of cricket, but it's like, I guess the opportunity, like for me as a player, what matters to me is like driving into, we call it work, it doesn't feel like work, driving in and feeling inspired like you're at a world-class venue, and getting the opportunity to train at those sorts of venues, whether it's Durham, Headingley, Old Trafford, the Oval, wherever your team is based, but pulling in there and being like, yeah, this is the best job in the world, to be honest. And then I guess with that is what the facilities and things look like, and availability. I think that's the biggest challenge. I know it has been probably one of the biggest challenges with the region so far, and I don't imagine it's going to go away in terms of this county structure is, okay, so if you've got men's first team, men's second team, women's first team, women's second team, and the facilities are the same as what has always been in terms of when there was only a men's first and second team, is like, where do people train? How many strips have you got on the square or whatever, if you're at the Oval, that you can turn over for, you know, trainings after trainings, men's, women's, whatever, and same within games, and just the volume of now cricket and preparation that's required. And then you've got things like your gym facilities. You know, the same thing is, you got all these teams trying to use the same facilities. How does that work? And I know, like, I've just come back from playing in Oz this winter, and it's like, you know, some of the facilities over there, the volume of just turf wickets that you need, the volume and the space that you need in an indoor school or whatever, it's doubling, isn't it? So how counties survive with that? I think Lancs have discussed sort of having like a women's venue where they have a training venue, essentially. Like, you see it, you know, I think sport should learn from other sports. Like, if I'm in cricket now and I'm in a leadership role or a director's role or whatever, I'm looking straight at Arsenal women. You know, like, they have done something right. I know there's something out this week where it's like, you know, the Emirates will host Arsenal women.
More than half of Arsenal women's game next season will be at the Emirates, and their average attendance this year at the Emirates was 52,000.
Yeah, so like, you're looking at that, and you I'm looking at Arsenal, I'm looking at Chelsea. Right, what have they done with their training facilities, with their, because, you know, they've grown, it's grown, hasn't it? Their stadiums they were never always selling out the Emirates. It's been like a growing beast, hasn't it? And it's like, okay, well, you know, to host to training, do you need a separate venue? Do you need to almost go into a club, take it over, build a gym, build an indoor school? And that is the home of men's cricket or women's cricket or whatever. It doesn't really matter who moves where. But I think, you know, there's going to have to be more space somewhere. You look at the Oval, for example. How do you host 4 teams in the gym and 4 teams training when you've only got so much to work with? For me as a player, that's the important piece to me, is, do I have an opportunity to prepare as best I can on surfaces that are going to be similar to what I'm playing? You know, the challenge is, like, you're going to play on the first class venues and the wickets are going to be good, but then if you're training at out grounds, club grounds, then the surfaces aren't going to be the same. So, you know, that is, for a batter, for me, that's the important bit. And I don't think there's a quick answer to that, but I do think that's something that's probably going to be the biggest challenge, I reckon.
Ben, this is the 3rd domestic restructure in 8 years. Why are the ECB doing it this time?
So basically, it's to tap in, I think, to the existing platform and tools, I guess, of county cricket, because essentially they think that's a better way to run a domestic women's cricket structure. This is in part of a wider move to give some power back to the counties. If you look at the ECB also giving 51% of 100 teams back to host teams, this fits into that way of seeing things, and perhaps the previous regime wanted to take a bit of that power away. And I guess it will also allow women's teams, from a cricketing point of view, to tap into facilities, resources, etc., that already exist at existing county teams. So, you know, for example, a strength and conditioning team that will exist for, you know, a men's first team county and academy. If the women's team is linked to the county, they can have access to that. Same with, you know, physios and that sort of thing. And then also some of the reasons they give are around the platform it can provide. So one of the key things they say in the bullet points they provided was they talk about accelerating team fandom. And if you break down what that means, I think it's that people basically are going to be more likely to be fans of Surrey women than South East Stars if they are already fans of Surrey. You've got that existing connection there.
And we've already seen it work with the 100, and I know that it was a slight accident that you had the double headers in the first year. The 100 it was a happy accident that's continued, but we found out straight away that people who are interested in one team were interested in both. And if you've already got Surrey, you might as well use that brand as opposed to start something else that's new.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes commercially as well. So I think they think so. It'll be easier for, using the example of Surrey again. They'll have a sponsorship team who can sell in a sponsorship for the Surrey women's team to one of their existing sponsors, rather than having sort of an ECB-based commercial team that is trying to sell, sponsors for 8 different teams to their probably, smaller pool of commercial partners compared to what you can get when you combine all the 8 to begin with tier 1 counties. And I guess they all think that the product eventually will be better and therefore easier to sell as well.
Do you think it's a good thing?
Well, there are definitely good things to it for sure. From a base point of view, if you're trying to introduce a fan to the game and you're trying to explain that there are all these different teams, anything that can streamline that is got to be a bit better, basically. I think it's good that it's happened overall. I think there's a sense that the ECB have figured that they need to do this thing at some point, and better to do it now and sort of work out the details later than to work out all the details and then you've missed the boat a bit and women's cricket has fallen that bit further behind where it should be, given the rate of change has been both like rapid, and also everything that's happened feels like it's happening sort of too late and after when it should have, kind of thing. And it was also interesting going through that bullet points. One of the things, or two things they talk about, the first one was ensuring stronger ownership, accountability and governance. And that feels a bit like the ECB's like almost talking about them not being sure of their own accountability if they're the ones running the teams. But I guess maybe if you give something to a county, maybe there's a more of a performance-driven thing there. I don't know, but it's an interesting thing to put in your bullet points. But then also they talk about providing long-term stability and a deeper sense of belonging. And as we've heard from Lauren, I don't think Diamonds players would feel that sense of long-term stability right now because of it. And there was only not long-term stability in the regional structure now because they've decided to do something different. If they hadn't decided to do something different, then they probably would feel quite long-term stable because that was becoming more and more entrenched. So I think that, yes, it's good that they've done it, but there's lots that is still to be worked out. And I think the patience will have completely run out if there is another big restructure in a couple of years' time. And there is already a bit of a sense of, oh, here we go again, I think.
How do they allocate the 8? We've already heard from one of the 10 not to get a tier 1 status straight away in Yorkshire, but they're not the only county that's agreed. Kent, for example, points to the fact that 9 of the 80 domestic players that had 100 deals last year came through the Kent system. The earliest that they can become a tier 1 county is in 4 years' time. Those players are obviously not going to wait for 4 years not being professional cricketers. They're going to go elsewhere. So they've done some amazing work. They're not being rewarded for it, which I understand, because this is not about rewarding past things. It's about creating a plan for the future. But how have the ECB gone around doing it? Because they weren't going to please everyone, but it's still interesting how they've ended up on the 8 they have chosen. Yeah,
so the first thing it says is we don't know exactly. The ECB have been almost sort of pointedly sort of closed shop about the reasons for their decisions. There wasn't really a press release explaining the decisions. There wasn't a press conference. So you have to read between the lines a little bit. That said, there are some clear trends. One is that of the existing 8 regions, they've basically picked one team from each of those. So that, and that makes sense given a geographical spread, but you also, in the case of Kent, Surrey were always going to get one. And that basically already eliminated Kent, but there is lots that would recommend Kent, for example, to get one. But there's also maybe a slight trend when you look at some of the closer decisions, which would be, I guess, Yorkshire, Durham and Kent v Surrey. 2 things that stand out about Yorkshire and Kent is they had intended to use not their first premier home ground as the main hub for
every game
team.
Yes. So I think Yorkshire, we're still planning on using Headingley a lot, but it's just Durham, are you going to use Chester Street every single time?
Yes.
And Kent had quite an interesting proposal, actually. They wanted the hub to be just Beckenham, which is a ground that I don't think we talk about enough. It's the 3rd London ground. It's Kent's 2nd ground. They don't call it an out ground. But yeah, the idea was that the women's side, their hub would be Beckenham, which is very accessible for people who live in South and South East London.
Yeah, and the Beckham plan sounds like a good one to me, but I also you can see why the ECB would prefer it the other way, just from an optics point of view. That it's a good thing to say that you're having that now. This thing that you've done means that women's domestic cricket outside the 100 is being played at major grounds all the time. And again, I'm not trying to demean Beckenham here, but that's how the ECB can sort of sell it, and that is a little bit harder to do if you have the men's and women's teams playing at different grounds. I guess there's also just likely to be other factors at play, basically, and the nature of this decision, where and if you accept that English women's cricket can't support 18 professional teams yet, and all the counties, pretty much with a couple of exceptions, wanted a professional team, there are going to be some noses put out of joint, and that could be based on quite arbitrary things sometimes, and that's kind of just the way it's almost has to be. Like the difference between the ninth most the ninth best submission and the eighth best submission was probably not huge, and there would could be like just a little bit of of what the ECB might have interpreted as commitment and that sort of thing each way. I guess with Yorkshire as well, there are questions there about obviously Yorkshire felt at the time it was an effectively a punishment for what has gone on there at the club recently. I think it can have taken some of those things and consequences into account without being a punishment as such. If ECB have questions or concerns about the governance of the club, also about the financial health of the club, obviously this comes with a big financial payoff, which is part of the reason why so many counties were annoyed as well, because it gives you it's a lump sum of money. But still, if Yorkshire are struggling financially, maybe you don't want to give them such an important responsibility if you're just not fully confident that they're going to be able to run to the best of their ability because of that, I suppose.
What do you think's next for your Kents and your Sussexes, the counties that applied for Tier 1 status, didn't get them? They're not test grounds, they're not 100 grounds, they are now literally called second tier counties in the women's games. It feels like the have-nots have less than they have ever had before.
Yeah, and people have talked about who are the Tier 1 and Tier 2 counties for a long time, and this the ECB calling counties Tier 1 and Tier 2, and this is the big unknown really, because in one sense, sort of maybe loads doesn't change immediately for the likes of Kent and Sussex, in that because we've had this regional structure in place and the 100, it's not as if
you're not disrupting an existing professional setup. They
Yes.
have a pathway that produces players
Yeah.
that don't become professional straight away. So that, and Kent have said they are still going to commit to funding what they have funded in recent years. So this doesn't, with Yorkshire, it's different because you're disrupting an existing professional setup and effectively disbanding it and moving it somewhere else. Whereas with Kent, using them as an example, or Sussex, who produce players, there isn't a professional setup there that you are changing. Mm-hmm. So actually, you're right. It's not as disappointing as they will be. That it is not actually changing anything from a junior to senior pathway thing.
Yeah, but then the thing is that because it is changing for other counties, they're obviously moving backwards while standing still, kind of thing. Like if we say that English cricket maybe can't support 18 professional women's team now, but that has to be the goal, right? To match the men's county system. But how can you close the gap that will be opened up by this? How, when you even wonder about it from a the Yorkshire point of view, that we talked about what's going to happen with the players who have to face that decision between not being pro for a couple of years, or between moving and then moving back, or whatever. You wonder how they're going to close that gap when they get Tier 1 status, and you wonder when you then introduce more professional counties who have to they won't have the core of players that these other counties will, and they're also just going to have that so many years less of that professionalisation having bedded in where they are, that is going to also be harder to overcome. And because of the grounds that they've chosen, and that they're also going to have to be building from a smaller base in some ways to catch that as well. So that is, it's tough to see how that happens, and possibly that gap never kind of closes. You do have a two-tiered, that's what they call it, a two-tier system that, and maybe they look at not having promotion relegation. We don't know what any of these competitions or structures are really going to actually look like in 2 years' time, really, let alone in 5 years' time and beyond. So that is maybe the biggest unknown, is what it means for those other counties, and just actually what tier 2, tier 3 looks like. And will that feel like another restructure again? Because if there is something that feels like another big reshuffle, I think patience is going to run out for a lot of women's cricketers who have had to, go through this already so many times.
Can't have 4 in 10 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We had some cricket this week. England kicked off their international summer with an interesting T20I against Pakistan. It's one of those games where in the end it was comfortable, but sometimes scorecards can deceive you. So at one point England were 11 for 4, and then at one point in the run chase Pakistan were 50 for 1 or 5 overs. There was also a good old-fashioned mix-up in there as well. Freya Kemp nearly running 2 to be run out after a bit of a ball watching from friend of the podcast and England captain Heather Knight. But Ben, England pulled it back in both innings. Amy Jones in her 100th T20I with the bat helped rebuild the innings alongside Heather Knight, but also she had an outstanding game behind the stumps.
Yeah, and she has just become a pretty dependable part of that middle order. Actually, overall, her record at 5 and 6 is pretty handy now, sort of averaging in the mid-20s in those spots and scoring pretty quickly. She's got on a good run of form, really finished that New Zealand tour really strongly. And yeah, some of the stuff behind the stumps, like the sort of wrong-footed take to take one off the inside edge is crazy. Yeah, but then also the one standing up off pretty thick edges. Yeah, so easy for them to clang out. And it's just reliable brilliance, isn't it? And it can make such a difference. So yeah, that was really encouraging. Danny Gibson was also really good. Her best innings, I guess, so far. Just like the exact thing you'd want from your finisher.
And we were talking about the battle for the number 7 last week, and 41 off 21. Yeah, as you say, that's her best innings for England yet. So that's good news for her. Yes, although she did then get some tap with the new ball. It was the Pakistan opener, Samash had. I guess she was Smashed, wasn't she? But she'd made 3 ducks in her 4 T20 innings before today, and then comes out and gets 20 off and over off Gibson, and so that is an important second string that England will want the person in that role to nail. So although when Siva Brunt's back in the side, Siva Brunt is probably opening the bowling. Yes. So Gibson wouldn't actually have to fulfill that role in a full strength England side. That's true. Yeah, I think you'd still want. Not opening the bowling. That's true. But I guess England will just want to, and also because it's one of those also scorecards you look at and you're like, how were Pakistan 50 for 1 off that? Because you look at the open, it's like, well, none of them got like a really, none of them got a big score, but also were scoring that quickly, and none of the bowlers, like Lauren Bell's figures end up looking pretty good. But then it was just because they all pulled it back quite well. And so I suppose if Gibson's not taking the new ball, she's not going to be pulling it back. She's maybe bowling quite well. So yeah. There are some England fans who would have winced at some of the early shots, given that England had already lost an early wicket or 2 against Danny White and Alice Capsey's shots. Very modern dismissals. You've lost an early wicket, so you go harder. You didn't mind it necessarily. Well, obviously you mind it in the moment when England 11-4. It's a lot easier to be sort of to be understanding about these things when England go on to make 160 and then win the game pretty comfortably. But yeah, I think looking at it from how England will look at it, and I think it is reasonable that you can't just lose 1 early wicket and then sort of give up the power play to the opposition. And even 2 wickets, you might say that is still, that they bat pretty deep. They would back their ability to rebuild if they lost another one, and in fact that's what happened. And you'd wonder if it's execution and shot choice in particular. But then even then, that shot that Capsey played, like we've seen her hit that for 6s that go miles, and she just got it slightly wrong. But still, they got up to a really good score. Yes. And an old-fashioned way of looking at it would be when you've lost a couple of early wickets, knuckle down, and actually your ceiling is pretty low in those games, which although you've taken the less risky option, once you've taken that option, the game is still very much up for grabs. Whereas here, England kept going. They consolidated for a bit, but they were able to put together a properly match-winning score, and they ended up winning pretty comfortably.
Yeah, I guess there's just both ways to do it. I mean, it would also be fair to look at the Capsey dismissal and think like you have literally just lost a wicket, maybe just a couple of balls and then go. But then equally,
that's the way they play.
And if she hits that for 6, what a great transfer of pressure that is.
Exactly.
And then it's also one of those where you can get confused between two different things. Like the shots look like bad cricket and sort of maybe they are, but it's because of aggression, and then the run out is bad cricket, but just straightforwardly bad cricket. The only slight mitigation, right, is that Knight is worried about getting run out off a deflection off the bowler, so that's why she's got back. But then she is still just looking a bit too far.
The ball watching,
yeah,
probably what undoes Kemp a little bit.
Yeah.
You did some stats digging, and you found that England are worse without Nat Sciver-Brunt. What else have you got? Australia not as good without Bradman.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, because I wondered whether England weren't just worse than Nat Sciver-Brunt, but whether actually the absence made the other players worse, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's actually, I couldn't quite find anything that backed that up. But it's crazy how different the statistics are. So I was looking back to the start of 2022, I think. And also, I guess just one thing that's worth pointing out is Nat Sciver-Brunt has missed a fair few games in that time. She missed this first game with a minor operation. I think she's expected to be back for the Friday game, so that's not too much to worry about. But just when you get an all-rounder at that stage of their career, they can just miss more games than is ideal, and you just need to be prepared for that to happen at an inopportune moment, I guess. But so she's missed 12 out of the 38 games in that time, and I think England with her in the side average overall about 25 with the bat, and without her about 21. But if you just take out her runs in the games that she's played, that average drops to 21 again. So I guess still that is a tiny bit of evidence, because you're looking at one specialist batter fewer there in the games where she has played, if that makes sense, because in the games where she hasn't played, you're replacing her in the team with a batting option. So that average indicates maybe a slight drop off, but probably not enough to think that they all just lose their heads when one of the best players.
But I think it's a fair point to make is that in the absence of one of your star players who steps up, and although I completely understand what you're saying, and that is probably what England are saying in the dressing room, they've clearly got a message of go out there, take the attack to your opposition. At the same time, you also, in the really difficult games, you sort of want players to take responsibility for the very specific match situation, and that is what Heather Knight and Amy Jones ended up doing. So yeah, it's a hard one to balance, and maybe when everyone's fully fit, that balance between the top three really going for it, and you've almost got that buffer of the three that come after them, is quite a good mix.
Yeah, and especially how Heather Knight played, and yeah, you do. Obviously, it's also easier to sort of go into your, or it's more accepted to go into your shell when you're 4 down, obviously, because especially Heather Knight will know there if she gets out there, that could be a proper skittling for 60, and then you lose the game, which is different to obviously because they did manage to get up to that score even though they lost the early wickets before then. But her form is still so encouraging, because this was a format that she had not cracked in the same way as ODIs and tests. And yeah, I guess the other thing that's obviously, this is just one game and there's 2 more games this series, and it's a Pakistan side that's quite hard to work out what lessons we should take from in terms of their strength, because their results just go up and down. I mean, I guess that's Pakistan cricket for you, but they got Hayley Matthews early this year, but then beat New Zealand in the series before that, and then lost to Bangladesh, and then beat South Africa 3-0 at home. And actually that South Africa series would have been the one that was slightly in the back of my head when they got to 50 for 1, because you're sort of looking at thinking with how they're getting these runs, they're playing a lot of really crisp, sweet drives sort of along the ground, piercing the infield in the power play, but then getting that boundary over you need after the power play is going to be a lot tougher. But actually you think back to that and think, well, they were just making 150 regularly, they were sort of getting good starts and then pushing on. It was not out of the realms perhaps it could have felt, I guess, but in the end England just quite a lot too good when they sort of turned it on bowling wise.
There's quite a long gap between the first and second game in the series. That is it for today's episode. We'll be back at the same time next week, next Thursday. The Metro Bank Girls and Cricket Fund, in collaboration with the ECB, aims to triple the number of girls' cricket team by breaking down barriers and creating supportive and inclusive spaces. Help transform the game. Head to metrobankonline.co.uk/cricket to champion the future of girls' cricket.